everyone. I don't know how many people I'm speaking to, but welcome to our digital transformation event. My name is Mel Pardo and I'm the Data Protection Officer for the BDO Group, and that includes C5 and Greenlight and Sator. Thanks for your time today. I'm going to be talking today about data sovereignty and why it matters, and I'll just be taking you through a few slides. There's a Q&A facility on this, so if you've got any questions, just type them in and I'll answer them as I go along. This does feel a bit strange because I'm used to seeing people's faces, but let's go. So just a brief run through of what I'll be talking about. The first thing I'll talk about is what data sovereignty is, as in the definition, because it can be misused actually. The impact of data protection and the relevance of data protection, how safe the cloud is, whatever the cloud is, and data residency versus data sovereignty. I'll talk about the big players like Google and so on, and hybrid multi-cloud solutions. And then I'll finish off talking about extraterritorial issues and Channel Island specifics, and then go through a brief checklist of advice and responsibilities for supplying the cloud or for purchasing it. So data sovereignty is a term that's thrown around quite a lot and quite often wrongly. So just to drill down into the detail, data sovereignty is a country-specific requirement, which means that data is subject to the laws of the country in which it's collected. It also means that data must remain within the borders. So the purpose of this is to prevent misuse of data and to prevent it leaving the jurisdiction. It's not really a new thing, so various countries have had laws in place for many years preventing data leaving their borders. For example, Russia, China, Germany, France and various other countries in Europe. So it's not purely a GDPR issue, although that is relevant as well. So the relevance of GDPR or data protection. So according to data protection law, all data collected on citizens has to be stored in the EU, or it has to be within an adequate jurisdiction. So Guernsey and Jersey obviously would count as adequate jurisdictions. So that's where the European Commission has determined that those jurisdictions are safe places for data to go. So whether you use a cloud service or whether you provide one, you are bound by data protection legislation and the obligations of that. You need to be certain where your data is going to be stored, and you need to think about the risk and responsibilities around security, storage, retention, and all the other requirements. It is possible to, and you can outsource the storage and management of your data to a cloud provider, and for many companies that's a very good idea. However, you can't outsource responsibility or the liability for that. So it's very important that you're aware of your responsibilities and that your cloud provider is the correct choice and that they will help you fulfill those responsibilities. You need to ensure your data is in the EU in an adequate jurisdiction or protected in transit via standard contractual clauses. For certain types of data, for example, tax data, there may be other legislation requiring it to be held locally. So you do need to think about GDPR and data protection, but you also need to think about legislation in wider terms. So with data protection, it's easy to get hung up just on the security principle and forget about the others, but we need to ensure that we fulfill all the other principles as well. So we need to fulfill lawfulness, fairness and transparency. Is there a legal basis for sharing that data and moving that data, processing it? And are we being transparent about it? Are we telling our customers what we're doing? Purpose limitation, are we using the data for what we collected it for, or are we doing something different with it? Are we processing the minimum data in order to do the thing we need to do and no more? Is that data accurate? Is that data stored for longer than it should be according to law? And the security principle, the integrity and confidentiality of data, which is probably the most obvious one, and finally accountability. So we need to look at all those when we're considering our cloud solutions on both sides. Now this is a phrase I've heard many times. I wish I had £5 for every time I've heard this. It's safe, it's in the cloud. Obviously that phrase doesn't really mean much on its own. We all know that the cloud is actually just someone else's computer, so we need to know which cloud and where that data is and where it's going to go. As a user, you'll need to know where your data is going to be, and as a provider, you need to be completely transparent with your customers as to where the data will be. Provided you follow due diligence, the cloud can often be the best solution. It provides safer and cheaper ways to keep your data secure because they operate at scale. It can provide expert archive, backup and security services. So outsourcing your data to the cloud is often a good idea, but it really depends on the context of what your data is and what your legal responsibilities are. So I mentioned earlier at the top about data sovereignty versus data residency. There is a slight difference and they're often used interchangeably, which creates confusion. Data residency deals where the data is, and sovereignty means the data is also subject to the laws of that jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions require local storage and highly regulate how the data can be moved out of the country and for what reason. So essentially, data sovereignty is data residency plus you have to follow the laws of the jurisdiction. So the big players, Microsoft, Google and Amazon Web Services are obviously the main cloud providers. They have cloud centers in countries all over the world. As part of that is to address latency, but it's also to address sovereignty requirements of their various clients around the world. Smaller vendors generally offer a more limited choice of data centers. That's inevitable because they haven't got the scale, or they may rely on one of the big three players to help them, so they may outsource some of their cloud provision to them. This can actually be a good idea depending on what your needs are. You have to be very specific about where the data resides though, so you may decide that your more sensitive data remains in the jurisdiction and other less sensitive data can be moved to the big providers. So there can be an uneasy relationship between software as a service and data sovereignty. So it's quite important to understand the relationship. There can be a tension between them because most cloud platforms weren't designed with data sovereignty in mind. They were designed with efficiencies in mind. And because the nature of the cloud obviously is that it's distributed architecture, that can cause tensions with data protection requirements to keep data in certain places and also to know where your data is. So when data is being moved about and backed up in various places, it's quite hard to keep track of where it is, and that can cause issues with data protection. Because it's fragmented, it's quite challenging to guarantee or even know where the data is at any one time. So that's something that we need to be clear about from the outset. So the provider needs to be transparent about it, and the purchaser needs to be clear about what their particular requirements are, because it can really depend on context. Suppliers can only make sovereignty guarantees for countries where the data centers are. So there's a data center in Jersey, we can make a pretty cast iron guarantee about sovereignty within Jersey, but we can't make guarantees about other jurisdictions, and that applies for all cloud providers. To offer sovereignty, any cloud provider needs to offer multiple data center locations based on the local regulations, or they need to be pretty transparent and clear about where that data is going, so you can decide if that meets your needs. The provider also needs to allow the client to select where their data is stored and incorporate access and security controls according to local laws. So there is an assumption sometimes, and a bit of a myth, that if your data is stored locally, then it's necessarily confidential or private and nobody can get at it without your consent. That's not necessarily the case. This was highlighted quite prominently with the passing of the US Cloud Act in 2018. Now this finally decided the question of the limits of federal courts and cross-border rediscovery. So there was a landmark case where US law enforcement wanted to get data from a user of Microsoft in relation to a drug trafficking case. The data was actually residents in Ireland, and Microsoft argued that because it was an island, then they didn't have to disclose the data. The case eventually was dropped, but the ensuing Cloud Act clarified that in fact US tech companies are subject to data discovery, and they can be compelled to disclose data regardless of where it is. So that's something worth bearing in mind. It's analogous to Jersey, where clients need to be sure if their data can be discovered. There may be various subpoenas or warrants and so on requesting data, and you need to be mindful of the fact that it doesn't really matter where that data is. This type of legislation isn't particularly new. We have the Patriot Act, the Stored Communications Act, which are also American laws. And in the UK, we have the famous Snoopers Charter. And there's similar laws in Russia and China. So I just want to talk a little bit about Jersey and Guernsey. So I mentioned earlier that the European Commission determines whether jurisdictions that aren't in the EU are adequate in terms of transferring data to them, and by adequate I mean that they provide sufficient security controls and privacy protections for data subjects. So Jersey and Guernsey currently have adequacy, as does the United Kingdom, and they have adequacy independent of each other. So it's hypothetically possible, although maybe unlikely, that either Jersey or Guernsey could continue to have adequacy and the other one would lose it, for example. With Brexit, it is possible that the United Kingdom may lose adequacy. If there's a no-deal Brexit, then the adequacy decision may fall away. So we're yet to see what happens with that. But it's something that's worth considering. So when you're purchasing a cloud provider, or if you are a cloud provider, it's really worth considering where the data is going to be, and maybe future-proofing that and thinking ahead if you're going to process data within the United Kingdom. So to sum up, you have an obligation to protect your data and your customers' data, so you can't outsource the liability or responsibility. You can outsource the service. You need to implement privacy by design, so the data protection idea that you put data protection in as a default at the front of any processing activity, not afterwards as an afterthought. You build it into what you're doing. You need to make sure you know where the data is moving before the data moves. And as a customer, you should make sure that you're not violating any of the local laws, and the responsibility really is on you to know what data you have, what your customers require of you, and what your legal responsibilities are. As a provider, on the other hand, you need to be transparent about what you're providing, where the data is moving to, what your backups comprise, where the backups go, all that kind of thing. You need to ensure that the appropriate security and controls are in place, and it's clear which party is responsible for what, so there can be no misunderstandings if there's an incident in the future. It's very, very important that the contracts you sign set out which party is responsible for what. For example, if there were to be a subject access request or a data disclosure demand, you would need to set out who is responsible for arranging that. If there's a breach, you would need to set out who's responsible for reporting that breach and managing it. Screen freezing. So finally, here are the key factors that you would consider. And I think this checklist is quite useful for both parties. Think about where your data will be stored, and in a distributed and fragmented architecture, which is typical of cloud, that's sometimes quite difficult to establish, but it's not impossible. So you need to set that out. So it's very important that you know where it is. Sometimes the backups will be in a different place and that kind of thing. Who will decide? So you need to know if the third party is potentially going to move the data without your consent or knowledge. You need to check the terms, and that comes back to contracts as well. You need to consider your local laws. Do your local laws mandate certain retention periods? Is using the cloud going to mean that the data is kept too long or not long enough? Do your local laws dictate certain security standards, and is your provider going to provide those? Is there a secure destruction policy? And are you allowed to move the data at all? There's a bit of a myth around that. It's not actually as restrictive as some people think. It's not usually a problem to move Jersey data outside the jurisdiction, not usually, although there are certain restrictions for certain types of data, for example, tax. You need to consider data security, and this is in the pure security sense. So does a third party conduct annual security audits? Do they have a certification? Do they have an ISO certification? Do they do regular checks? Do they train their staff? Do they restrict access to the minimum? So you need to think about all those security considerations as well. Is there multi-factor authentication? All those kinds of things. And that's probably the most obvious part of the checklist, but it's still the central part. You need to consider the type of data involved. So there's no silver bullet solution for this. If it's innocuous data that's not personal, it may not be a particular problem with which supplier you use. But if you're processing special category data, such as health data or criminal data, or commercially sensitive data, you might need to think carefully about what provider you choose. You need to think about who owns the data. So again, this comes back to contract. You need to be clear who the data controllers are and who the processor is. So typically the client would be the data controller and the cloud provider would be the processor. However, a cloud provider can in certain situations be a controller if they do certain things. So you need to set that out. You need to set out a data processing agreement, which would usually be appended to the contract, which would set out those responsibilities and requirements. So GDPR requires certain clauses to be in any contract that involves data processing, and that would usually be appended as part of the data sharing agreement, data processing agreement, beg your pardon. And finally, it's really important that you're transparent. If you're storing your client's data on the cloud, you need to make sure that it's written in your privacy statement and that they're quite clear where their data is going. In order to comply with legislation, you need to be fair and lawful and totally transparent about where the data is. You need to tell them where your data centers are and what's happening to their data at every stage, and you need to inform them of their rights as well. So that's the final slide. I haven't gone into too much technical detail. It's just intended to be an overview. I haven't had, oh yes, I have had a question through. Sorry, Steve. Okay, so Steve's asking, does the UK have an adequacy statement yet for post-Brexit, or are they still only covered by EU transition agreements? Last time I checked, there isn't an adequacy statement. That would have to be assessed at the time. I think Theresa May's deal, which seems about a million years ago now, did have a provision in it for adequacy to continue for a transition period. But obviously that's out of the window now. So I think it really depends if there is a deal and what the deal comprises. UK will be adequate until the end of the year by default, and we'll see what happens after that. So it's in the air, essentially. Does anyone else have any questions? It feels very strange talking to myself in an empty room. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any more questions. I'll just give it another 10 seconds. It's quite strange doing it this way because I'm used to normally being in the room with people and people interrupt and ask questions throughout, which is more what I'm used to. Okay, guys, there doesn't seem to be any more questions, so I'll wrap this up a little bit early. Thank you very much for your time. If you want to email me after this, if you've got any further questions or you want to talk about cloud service, my email is mpardo@bdo.je. So thanks again for your time.